Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Glasgow Loves EU lockdown live stream. We're delighted to welcome tonight Professor Paul Cardwell. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us tonight. My name is Fiona Wishlade, and also with us on the chat are Jenny Wilson and Bernd Poor. Jenny is monitoring the social media for questions that come in through Facebook or Twitter, so please send in questions if you have them. And Bernd is making sure that all the technology works for us and recording the session for anybody who can't make it live. So Paul, by way of background, you're a professor of law at Strathclyde University, although you haven't made it up here for quite some time from what I gather. You've recently published a book on the politics of EU law, which is obviously very relevant to. Oh, you're going to show us a copy. Hadn't realised we were going to be part of your promotional tour.
Why not?
Why not? Okay, and you've also worked on the issue of EU external relations, which is something obviously that the UK is going to be on the sharp end of before too long, and you've a particular interest in immigration, and you've submitted recently some evidence to the House of Commons Select Committee on the UK-Japan trade deal, and have done so to other committees as well. So you've got quite a number of areas of expertise that are of interest to us, and we want to try and pick your brains on some of those. So just to give our audience a chance to think up their questions, the main topics we want to try and have a look at are freedom of movement, immigration and asylum, and famously, of course, trade deals. So before we turn to the social media ones, maybe I can kick off with a wide-ranging question. I mean, we're at the stage of we still don't know incredibly whether there's going to be a deal or not, but it seems to be psychologically a kind of prevailing view that if there is a deal, that things just kind of carry on as now. But that's not the case, is it? And can you maybe summarize for us some of the key things that you think will change, irrespective of whether or not there's a deal?
Sure. Okay, well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. Oistama Tapaleva Harjin. One of my lockdown projects was to learn some Gaelic, so there we are. Absolutely. So you're right. You're absolutely right, Fiona, that one of the assumptions at the moment seems to be, well, Brexit as an event has happened. I mean, sometimes people need to be reminded that Brexit has happened as an event. So we left at the end of January. As a process, Brexit hasn't happened fully, and will never be completed, because we know from Switzerland, for example, that it's constantly in this kind of renewal of agreements and discussions and these sectoral discussions, and then there's referendum and things, popular votes in Switzerland which cast doubt on things, and it's an ongoing process that my colleagues in Switzerland, characterize the relationship between Switzerland and the EU. And frankly, I think that will end up being the case with the UK. But as I said, I think you're absolutely right. There's a prevailing view, well, nothing really happened at the end of January, therefore nothing's really going to happen at the end of December. But actually this is, the crunch time, because the transition period essentially that we've been in this year has made very little difference that many people would notice. So we know that people, especially in Northern Ireland, who are, getting notices saying, oh, well, we can't deliver there, that kind of thing, and starting to see the difference. I think we'll get more and more of the kind of headlines we got today about UK citizens not being able to, stay in second homes for, more than 3 months of the year, and that kind of thing. So, the emphasis on the physical infrastructure in Kent, particularly, but also at other members, might make people think that things are going to change. But not only, I think, is there a prevailing view that not much is going to actually change, but also that any changes might just be sort of temporary, and okay, things might be difficult, but then they're difficult with lots of other things going on at the moment anyway. And I think that it's more some of the longer term changes and the things that we've become used to without necessarily realizing it. For example, things like EHIC cards. I mean, we know that if you get into a problem, you need emergency care, then you can get it within a European country, and not everybody always has insurance. And the worst thing to happen to somebody is not think about that, not get insurance because it's only a weekend away in Amsterdam or in somewhere else, Brussels maybe, or Germany or Budapest, something like that, and they have an accident and then they get into hospital and then they have to pay the full fees, and that's when it's going to start hitting home. So I hope that doesn't happen to people, but I think those are the kind of things I think, well, actually this is what actually Brexit is about, and the lack of a continuation deal, as well as many more longer term things which result from any kind of divorce. So what about people who've spent some time working in another member state for where there might be some kind of pension rights or something? How does that work? And we're in very much unprecedented territory, and to actually be able to count everything is very, very difficult, and especially in the timeframes that we've been talking at with everything else that's going on, is almost impossible to fully comprehend. And we don't really know exactly what it's going to look like. But I think also the last thing to say on this is that because we've had 4 years of this and the positions have become entrenched, so even now when you say, well, there's going to be these big lorry parks, you're still slightly up against a kind of viewpoint of, oh well, that's just that's just in case, or that's still quote unquote project fear. It might not actually come to that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's much more than that. I mean, some of those things are going to happen anyway, aren't they?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
whichever.
Yeah. I mean, a deal. And I'd kind of almost want to ban the word deal because it gets used so much and doesn't really mean that much. If any kind of agreement that comes about within the next week or week and a half is not going to simply replicate what we have. I mean, this is just not the case. So there will be disruption. We know from the evidence that we have, and it's not conjecture to say, well, everything will be sorted out. For some things we might notice a bit less of a difference, but for other things then we certainly will. So all the things about the car parks, about the difficulties, about the bureaucracy, that is the consequence of leaving. That's why the rules on the single market are there. So if you're not in the single market and you don't have something which replicates those, and we know this is the case because the government's been very, very consistent on it in the last few years, then we know that the paperwork will apply on both sides of the channel.
Yeah. Okay. So we know there are going to be changes, and so maybe let's move on to some of the more specific issues. So the first topic I wanted to say something about was freedom of movement. This is one of the big issues in the referendum, and I mean, you and other people have pointed out that freedom of movement was anyway not as it seemed. I mean, you weren't free just to go willy-nilly and settle in another country. Can you maybe just start off by explaining that, and then we can go on to some of the changes?
Yeah, sure. So the way that the law developed from the early stages of European integration was about the free movement of workers. So although we talk about people, and it's true to talk about people, but it was mainly about workers. It was people who are economic actors. And of course, years and years later, we know that, well, people move, and people don't just simply move and then move back, or, single people move somewhere, work a bit and then move back. Some people do, but many others don't. You have complex relationship with people, with, family members who are from outside the EU. And then, of course, children are born outside the country of birth of their parents. All of this adds in the complexity. But you're right, freedom of movement was never, an absolute right. Member states were and have been able to prevent people from moving simply to take advantage of social security or unemployment benefit or anything like that. So although the law has become very, very extensive, it was never absolute rights, and the UK didn't always make use of the exceptions that it had. So it's not only is it an unlimited, not an unlimited right, but also I think it's only to the extent that member states are able to regulate other aspects of movement, particularly around people who are not working and so on. So being clear that the UK is left out, and that we do have clarity on, because we know that free movement has ended for people coming into the UK, and therefore as a natural consequence the other direction as well. But because the UK is a third country, the way in which member states deal with UK citizens is very much like the UK could deal with non-EU citizens during the time of membership. And that's essentially that it retains, that the member states retain their own power and competences to do so. So yes, the immigration debate within the referendum was about free movement, although it often fused free movement with non-EU migration. And the UK always had control. The UK could always say, well, yes, we want to accept people in from this country, or we want to restrict, or we want to open up routes because we need more agricultural workers, high skilled workers. All of this was within the UK's competence anyway. So this is where there will be a definite change. How UK citizens are treated by other EU member states also depends a little bit on, well, more than a little bit, on those member states themselves. So we know that there are rules around on Schengen for those countries which are in the Schengen agreement, which is most of them, on short stays. But anything other than that, like long-term retirements or students and so on, is going to be more complicated, because you'll have to look at what the individual rules of those member states were. They could be quite liberal or welcoming, and they could be more restrictive, as the UK has done.
Okay, so I mean, it's going to impact on very large numbers of families. So I mean, maybe starting looking at EU citizens here. What's happening to them? What are their rights and entitlements going forward, and how simple or otherwise are things going to be for them?
Okay, so, well, there's the EU settlement scheme, which has now been in place for a couple of years, and which people have been encouraged to register for. Quite how many people have or haven't registered. We know how many people have registered, because obviously the government has a record of who's actually done it. What we don't know is who hasn't. And of course, because the UK didn't have records of who was coming in and not, and things like national insurance numbers, you might have a national insurance number, but no longer be in the UK. So we don't know, exactly to the extent which the efforts by groups like 3 Million and so on to reach those people and make sure that they apply for settled status. We also know that some people have applied for it and been given pre-settled status, which is not the same thing. And of course, anybody who's arriving up to the end of this year should apply for pre-settled status, which includes students and so on. So that doesn't guarantee a future status on the spot. And of course, some people have got that when they really should have got settled status. And this has been one of those areas where, for a long time, it didn't really matter, because the UK hasn't been a system where the proof of documents has been one which has been particularly strong for EU citizens, or indeed for UK citizens as well. So that's not to say there haven't been difficulties, but it's always been possible to get a permanent residence card, because I know this from personal family experience, and it was a very laborious process of a 92-page document to simply get a flimsy paper card, which didn't give you anything that you didn't already have, because under EU law, if you'd already stayed 5 years in the member state, you were a permanent, lawfully, then you were a permanent resident. So it didn't say anything more, but this was required then in order to get British citizenship, which previously, as an EU citizen, well, apart from things like being able to vote in all elections, there weren't overriding reasons to do it. Whereas, of course, now, for many people, there are, if it's an option, and if it's something that they want to do, and if it's not going to result in them having to give up the citizenship of whichever European country, if that country doesn't allow dual citizenship, which we know that some of them don't.
Yeah, some of them don't. So the other side of the coin then, as well, are UK citizens living in EU 27 countries, and what their rights are. So if I understand you correctly, those vary between countries depending on the domestic situations.
Yeah, that's right. So, and they will have various schemes of registration and allowance of rights and so on as well. And yes, it could vary. So that there is a new push by UK embassies to reach to those people, and they're writing to them. But obviously, there've been events being held and information campaigns for quite a long time. And of course, some member state governments have been sort of very proactive, and others a bit less so, or some have sort of said that they will extend the rights and so on, but haven't necessarily then followed that up with changes. For others who already have established sort of resident permit, even as EU citizens, states can require you to kind of register with the police or something, as you would in your own, with your own citizens. It's just the UK hasn't quite had that sort of, tradition when you change address or something like that. So it does vary a lot, and there's a danger, of course, that UK citizens, could fall through the net there.
Yeah, and there was some big article in the press this morning about UK citizens who've moved to other EU countries and then could face considerable difficulties in coming back to the UK if they chose to, with their families as well. So I mean, are we looking at a kind of like another Windrush somewhere further down the line?
I think that's very possible, and because, of course, the rules are changing very, very quickly, and because immigration law is such a complex area and gets added to by successive ministers, where we tighten up the situation, we bring in more rules and more rules and more rules. I mean, immigration law handbooks are, you don't drop them on your feet because, you'd break a toe or something. Not from personal experience, I have to say, but we know that it's an incredibly difficult area of law. And that also means that when you've got people who are trying to find out if they could, for example, as you said, Fiona, come back to the UK with a partner who is from outside the EU, what does that mean? And there's a danger of a lack of certainty in decision making. So with the best will in the world, the people making decisions on applications may not be able to do so quickly, and may get it wrong because of the complexity. And it's very possible, and we do hear more and more stories of British people who've been living abroad, using their EU rights, being essentially in the position of being second-class citizens because they can't return to the UK because of family members, dual nationals, and so on as well. And it shows, the limits not only of where EU law is, because this was not harmonised at all in this aspect of migration law, and it's particularly not when you get to citizenship and nationality, which varies considerably across the member states. But obviously with the UK, so many people have gone to live, to work in member states, or spend some of the time. That's why it's difficult sometimes with figures, because you might have people who live through the winter in a warmer country and then come back and go forward, back and forth, and there's big considerations, particularly on things like healthcare, which is of course a particular concern for people who get older. And there is a danger that people have thought, well, it's not going to affect me, and this is where sort of local actors, I see, things like the prefecture in the Dordogne, which has a large UK population, trying to reach out to people to make sure that they've done what they need to do to make sure that they don't have any problems. But certainly on the UK side, the pressure that's been to try and resolve these questions, and it's very, very difficult to do. And it's impossible also to foresee all the complexities that people have, because people have moved around and people have complicated
lives. Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Before we maybe move on to the next topic, Jenny, have we got anything come through on the issue of freedom of movement from social media that you want to throw into the discussion?
Yes, in fact, somebody was talking about the article in the Guardian yesterday about the fact that UK citizens might not be able to return if they don't all meet the residency requirements. And somebody's asking, there's just two sort of points. One is about the permanent resident paper. Is that only lawful in the UK up until the UK leaves the EU totally? Will it be obsolete after that. And someone, actually the same person, Tom Newton, is asking again about the movement of pensions. So I guess he's earned some pension abroad and some in the UK, and particularly within Scotland as well. Is there moves to make sure people can gather all their pensions together?
On the pension fund, I slightly regret mentioning this now. I don't know, even though I worked in France as well, so I do have a small amount possibly of money there. I think there are. I mean, it's very possible that there's some there's some agreements that are pre-EU which might come into place. I mean, obviously only with certain countries, and you would expect it with somewhere like France or so. Hopefully in time this would be something, because it would affect people going in both directions. So you'd hope there'd be the motivation that this would be one of the kind of things that would be sorted. For the permanent resident, so the permanent resident card is a UK immigration thing. So somebody is granted permanent residency, although under EU law it's for EU citizens who are resident in other member states for 5 years have permanent residence. It's not something that you apply for, you have it as of law. But in the UK you never needed to prove it unless you're applying for nationality, which relatively few people did, because as I said, apart from voting in Westminster parliamentary elections, you wouldn't have needed to do it. So it's only after that it came a bit more of an issue. The settled status, I mean, that will be important, because people will have to prove when they want to, rent a flat or things like that they or get a new job, that they have an appropriate immigration status. And so that would be similar to a non-EU citizen. If they're applying for a job, would show that they have leave to remain, and if they don't, then they would need to show that they've got a sponsor or something like that. So the problem with the settled status is that it doesn't come with any physical proof. And that I think is a very, very big problem, because if you're saying to people like landlords, well, you've got to make sure that you're letting to people who have the right to be in the country. And how does a person say, well, I've got settled status, well, prove it. Well, I can't. That's a risk for the landlord to let to that person, because they might find themselves, what if that person is not lying and they don't have, or they think they have settled status and actually they don't, and therefore the landlord is in breach of the law and could face sanctions. You think if you were a landlord, what would you do? And that's potentially putting people in a very, very difficult situation. So the Windrush is not only about that aspect of immigration, but also people who are already here.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to a partly related topic, which is that of immigration. Again, this was, a big part of the Brexit agenda, and this summer we've again seen really distressing scenes in the English Channel. Now, I know it's really like complicated area, but can you explain a bit for us what are the implications of Brexit for asylum seekers and migrants from non-EU countries? I mean, I think we know to some extent that the Brexit agenda was partly about people coming from non-EU countries, and the two things kind of got rolled into one a little bit. And there's also this question of the Dublin Regulation. How does that work, and will it still work after we've fully left? And are people going to be disappointed, those people that wanted Brexit going to be disappointed with the outcome in terms of immigration?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing, and the thing that we hear very often about this is the kind of, well, it's people shouldn't be coming to the UK because they've been through safe countries, and France being a safe country, and therefore people shouldn't be here. That's a misnomer. There's nothing under international law that requires you to claim asylum in the first safe country that you reach. Okay. So this has been doing the rounds for a very, very long time. Under EU law, the Dublin Regulation, what that does is say that people should be returned to the first EU country that they entered. So that could be the UK, whilst covered something right, but generally only speaking, if they flew into a UK airport as the point of entry. So the Dublin regulation allows people to be returned. Of course, then there's the issue of working out which country it is and whether they were, included in the registrations that took place, whether it's in, south of Italy or Greece or wherever. So the UK is leaving that. So it will no longer be able to apply the Dublin regulation. So it will be far, far more difficult to return people to any of these EU countries. I mean, that's just, that's the fact. So people who do want to see that are going to be disappointed. Of course, again, because immigration doesn't simply rely on EU competence, as a lot remains national competence. So there are bilateral treaties with France. And we saw over the weekend, again, there's another initiative, which is fine. I saw one immigration lawyer, tweeting, this is finally, we're told, the one that's going to stop boats. But, every year there's one of these kind of initiatives. And France has politics too. Yeah. And so these joint initiatives that we're going to stop, and it's going to increase patrols, and it's going to do this. And what we find is that over the winter and the colder months and the bad weather, the boat crossings drop, and then they pick up again in the summer, and no amount of charging boats or more police isn't necessarily going to stop that. What would stem it probably is offering things like safe routes, but the government, of course, doesn't want to do that because they think it's just going to encourage more people to go. But as I said, France also has politics, and of course, having large areas where people congregate around Calais is certainly not popular locally. Yeah. Where the response is, well, if these people want to go to England, why are we stopping them? Why is it our problem? Just in the same way that the reverse logic happens there. So I think it's going to be more difficult to return people because the regulations won't apply, and returning people to countries other than that is a very difficult process to do. Or I mean, it can be a time-consuming process. And of course, under international law, people have the right to seek asylum, and most of these asylum claims are granted at first instance, or indeed at appeal.
Okay, so I mean, in the end, what is the UK going to be able to take back control of in terms of immigration?
Well, it might do what the EU has been doing, which is to seek cooperation with third countries directly. So the idea of pushing back isn't necessarily just just a UK thing. It's also an EU thing too. Of course, the difficulties in doing so is that third countries don't often want to take people back, especially if it's people who are not citizens of that country, but people who've transited through. And one of the ways the EU has tried to sort of leverage this is by offering some kind of incentives. Yeah, so whether it's cooperation in other areas and so on. Can the UK do so? Well, maybe, but what has it got to offer? Maybe money. Yeah. In which case you can rapidly become really quite expensive, and then you need to work out, well, which countries is it? Is it going to be? And then you've got the actual physical issue of returning people directly, as well as human rights considerations to countries that you might want to be returning to. So taking back control might be actually in theory rather than in practice.
Okay.
Is the sense that I get.
All right. Okay. Well, we're running up against the clock a bit. So let me ask Jenny if there's anything. Is there anything on the issues of immigration and asylum seekers in the questions?
There's nothing on that at the moment. No.
Okay. All right. So the third topic we wanted to ask you about was the issue of trade deals. You gave evidence recently to the House of Commons Select Committee on this. Now, is the Japan trade deal really such a landmark agreement in the way that Liz Truss would have us believe? And what do you see as the sort of like the weaknesses or the flaws in this in the agreement?
Okay, so well, firstly, I'd like to back up a little bit, and in full disclosure, 20 years ago, I was an intern at the European Commission in Tokyo, having studied in Japan. I did my master's over there. And at the European Commission in Tokyo, this was right at the beginning of Japan starting to deregulate, starting to look at these agreements. So these free trade agreements are a relatively new thing. So Japan doesn't have one with the United States, which is its strongest partner, in the same way as the EU doesn't have one with the US either. We know about TTIP and that it failed. And so this is the EU-Japan deal is the product of a very, very long process of even negotiation, but pre-negotiation and getting to the stage where you can actually negotiate. So the EU agreement, which has now been in for a year or so, is still largely untested. We don't know exactly what benefits it has brought to EU member states, citizens, businesses, and likewise on the Japanese side as well. We know a bit more about, for example, the EU agreement with Korea, which has been in force now for much longer, but Korea obviously smaller and so on. So we don't really know about the Japan deal, and I'm quite agnostic on whether they are worth it, essentially. So they've taken on all kind of symbolic value. The UK Japan agreement. Okay, so I think that the fact that the UK has got an agreement with Japan is significant, and I think it's a significant achievement. And I think that the people who've worked on this, on the Japanese side and on the UK side, deserve credit, because these are not easy things to do. And even if most of the text is similar or the same as the EU agreement, we're dealing with a very short period of time where lots of different things can happen. And I think that particularly in civil servants, and I have no particular insight on this, but certainly from the knowledge that I have about how these deals are made, it is a significant achievement. And I also think that Liz Truss, who I'll get more onto in a moment, has given it political leadership and clearly made it a priority, and seems, as far as I can see, to have engaged with her Japanese counterpart. And so I think deserves some credit for actually getting this deal on the table. That said, the promotion of it as better than the EU deal, I don't think is necessarily justified. Again, we don't really know, because the UK was already part of the EU agreement. It might be longer term that the UK that the deal suited the UK anyway, in which case it would be difficult to know had the EU not concluded this agreement with Japan. So already we don't know that. The things about it which have been promoted as being somehow better, it seems that either it's not going to make too much difference. So I looked and gave evidence just on the migration aspect, and the migration aspect was one of the ones that was highlighted of, well, it's actually going to be better for access for UK professionals in Japan. And I couldn't really, there were some changes of definitions in the text, but I couldn't really see anything. And again, because immigration policy is national anyway, if the UK wanted to pass measures to facilitate longer stays for Japanese professionals, then it could do. So yeah, it was very difficult to see that's there. And likewise, with some of the things, and particularly we often regard goods, because goods are much more tangible than services. We can understand, selling a thing, somewhere. Well, okay, new markets, we focus on cheese a lot. I'm a big cheese fan. But having lived in Japan, and you think, well, how long has it taken in the UK to get used to products from other countries in the EU, despite the single market? Now imagine you're a smaller cheese producer and you want to get it into Japan. How much is that going to cost to get into the network, to get into the distribution? You don't, I think, have to be a specialist on management and distribution to think that it's going to be quite a tough thing, especially if you're up against big operators domestically. So it's going to take a lot for it to actually see whether it's worth it, but also whether there's any significant difference between the UK deal and the EU deal. So as I said, I think as even with Emily Thornberry's sort of evisceration of in Parliament last week, but she did say at the end of it, I welcome the deal, and I think that encapsulated it. Yes, it is an achievement to get this done, but trying to portray it as something which is going to be significantly different from what there was already there. And of course, we remember from a few weeks ago, which already seems like a lifetime ago, the soy sauce debacle. And I did do a Twitter thread because I'm a big fan of Japanese food, and the only Japanese food in my, or Japanese inverted commas food I could find in my house was stuff that I had physically brought back from Japan when I was there a year ago. Everything else was made in the Netherlands, Poland, or indeed in the UK, and therefore wouldn't actually be affected by this new trade agreement, but would be affected by having an agreement with the EU or not. And that's also, to bring full circle back to what we were saying at the beginning, one of those things. We wouldn't think that a Japanese soy sauce brand would be affected by an EU trade deal, but actually, because it's made in the EU, actually it
is.
would.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that we might find changes in ways that we probably, wouldn't be necessarily obvious to the casual observer.
Okay. And I mean, there's a number of, it's a sort of like a partial rollover of the EU-Japan deal, as I understand it. But there seems to be a lot that haven't got to that point. So presumably, then there's a kind of like a hiatus until those can be cobbled together once we leave.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't know what the exact state of play is now, but there are some that have been rolled over, and there has been a flurry of them. But again, and this is where we see, is Europe the EU, or is the EU Europe? To what extent are those interchangeable? Well, when you consider the agreements with large European but non-EU players such as Turkey, for example, that is also dependent because of the integration of Turkey with the EU. You've got this sort of jigsaw puzzle of trying to fit everything together. And quite thorny issues. The same applies with Ukraine and so on as well, and I think with Norway. So there are some continuation ones, but what happens with the ones whether there isn't a continuation deal? Well, I suppose this might come down to administrative practices on the border, and what's going to happen. What's going to happen there? So and I don't have an answer to that, I'm afraid.
Okay, sounds like a lot of work to get as close as we can to where we were before, but not quite as good.
Quite. Okay. I mean, that's, and I think normally, that I think we can be critical of Brexit as an idea, okay, but even if we park that, the process is the thing that I'm the most critical of, and I don't think that you have to sort of put your cards on the table as to whether you think that Brexit as an idea and leaving the EU is a good thing or not, to be critical. And even people who were ambivalent or even against EU membership would say, well, the process of how this has gone, you're talking about undoing 47 years of integration, not just cooperation, but integration, and doing so almost overnight. And whilst the amount of work that's been done on the withdrawal, agreements and getting those over the line, and what's being done now on new agreement, it is a phenomenal amount of work that's been done. I think we have to recognize that, but it's been done in such uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And any state that wants to join the EU, you're talking about a 10-year process. So for me, the sort of rule of thumb was that, well, surely if you want to leave the EU and set yourself up in a way that resolves as much as you can these institutional questions and these very, very important matters that we've been discussing with tonight or touched on, you'll never resolve everything, but a longer term process, you wouldn't change things overnight in any other situation. So, I don't think anyone would have said that we're a month away from leaving the transition agreement and we don't know what's going to be happening, and that for me is the most unbelievable thing about it, that we just don't have that certainty. And it's not just ironing out the very finer details. We're still talking about big issues and then having to get ready within 3 weeks or so, and that the danger is that the political rhetoric ramps up, and that can be counterproductive.
Okay, right. But before we wrap up, Jenny, is there anything further through from social media that you want to?
Yep. So Darren is just saying that the Japan trade deal is great for Japan. The And just wondering, like we've heard the big car companies, the sort of big Japanese car companies, did they maybe put some pressure on making sure that deal happened, and or are they more interested in the EU, UK getting a trade deal?
Yeah, I mean, whether the trade deal with Japan is better for Japan, I'm not sure. I'm not sure there was anything. Again, it's very difficult to. You can't just read the thing like a book and say, oh well, actually it favours one or another. I mean, the fact that it's more or less a carbon copy of the EU agreement suggests that either the EU-Japan agreement is better for Japan, which it might be, but there was certainly no pressure on the EU to, it's not in the same state that the UK is to try and get something over the line. So it might be better for Japan, but we don't know longer term. For the car companies, I don't think it was as much of the EU-Japan, because it's not about exports from Japan to the EU, but more about, that the purpose of having the car companies here dates from the promises made in the 1980s about the UK being part of the single market and being able to then, export, and that's where it's going to hurt. I'm a bit surprised that they've almost waited so long, but then, a car, even if they wanted to say, well, unless there's a deal, we're going to leave, that's a huge amount of investment over a long time. Lots of infrastructure to move, from one place to another, is very, very difficult. There is a book that's come out. I'm going to plug somebody else's book now. There's a book that came out by a Japanese friend of mine who actually has spent quite some time in Glasgow. So there's a nice link there, whose book was about Japanese car factories investment and British trade unionism from the 1980s. So he covers all of these developments from the very sort of personal way in which Thatcher went about sort of convincing the Japanese governments at the time. She had a very good relationship with one Japanese government in particular, to bring investment in, and of course now why that is all under threat from, well, really people in her own party.
Well, that sounds like well worth a read.
I can't find the exact title, but I'm sure I can.
Okay, well, you can email us and let us know. Okay, well, I mean, maybe just to finish up. I guess $64,000 question is, it's yet another crunch week, or is it? What is your money on a deal? What do you think's going to happen? How are things going to pan out?
I mean, I'm still. I'm not a betting man. Much. No, I'm not. I still think that there might be a thin deal, because I think that there is still the motivation for one. I think that a deal can be sold to the UK population by the UK government as being a success and spin it that way. But also, I don't think that Michel Barnier would want to finish this process with not having a deal, because that also looks like, it does look like a failure, doesn't it, to agree a deal with, a large economic, power nearby. But of course, we saw that the TTIP, agreement, didn't come in. They're very, very different, but sometimes these things happen. And the danger is the clock running out. And I really don't like this, oh, well, this is how, trade negotiations work. Well, maybe, but we're not really up against the same kind of deadlines as we are here. And to be honest, yeah, I don't know. But I think if I was pushed, I think maybe a thin kind of deal, but it's not going to do anything like what it would be promoted as doing in terms of certainty and so on. And all that will happen if there is no deal is that eventually we would just start this process again, but the UK would be in a much more, I think, would be in a weakened position. And because then there's not the same urgency, then we'd just be in a sort of endless cycle of trying to resolve the same issues about fish and about regulatory standards and so on, that we have now. It would take some of the issues off the table, because things like citizens' rights, I mean, have not quite been, I wouldn't say they were sorted, but the UK position has been clear in ending free movement. So that's but it also depends on what emphasis the EU would put on as well, and how prepared the EU is and EU member states are for no deal. And whilst they're saying that yes, they're ready and so on, we don't really know if and until it happens. I think that no deal still should be avoided at all costs, just because of the very human cost that it will have on the UK and population. But yeah, I mean, we keep saying, well, this is the final week because this is the deadline, and then it goes to another week and so on as well. But obviously, it's not just the governments. You've got the European Parliament. You've got what type of agreement it is as well. So maybe this week, but then last time, all of a sudden the withdrawal agreement was also, sort of there and then not there and then there again. So it could be possible that something is brought out of the hat at this stage. But I wouldn't put any money on it.
Yeah, it was probably as well. You're not a betting man then.
No. One bet a year on the Eurovision Song Contest, and that's my thing.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this evening. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your expertise with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you back in Glasgow, I hope, before too long.
Yes, very, very soon, I hope so. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for watching and participating. It's been a real pleasure.